Good afternoon, and first of all, thank you very much to Ronnie and for Asia Society for inviting me here. It's wonderful being in this building, in this new setting of Asia Society, and to also be on the Asian part of this great institution. I've had the occasion of participating in events in New York and have seen the work of Asia Society up close, and it's good to see that it is flourishing in the same manner in Asia. It is also very good being in this part of the world in my new capacity as the Dean of SAIS, given that this school has a particularly strong presence in this region, has a very deep legacy. It has trained many people who are in varieties of fields, from non-governmental to governmental to private sector in this part of the world, and in particular, SAIS has very strong relations with China that go obviously include the Nanjing Center, but also go beyond it. And we look very much to building that relationship and that footprint. I know Asia, this area of the world, remains particularly energetic, and it's growing, and it has a very big impact on how the rest of the world is changing as well. And we are obviously in that current. Now, I thought for purposes of our conversation today that I would raise a number of issues that are either explicitly on the table or we ought to think about, that involve United States foreign policy, its role in the Middle East, and in particular, what does it mean for Asia, and also what does Asia mean for these sets of issues. So if you're following the headlines, if you're looking at newspapers, you can see that it's a very particularly difficult and complicated period for American foreign policy. We've watched in the past 2 weeks the Syria crisis unfold in a very different way. For the past 2 years, we've seen Syria first start as a pro-democracy movement, then become a civil war, then become an exhibit of a regime brutally suppressing a popular uprising, to seeing the emergence of radical extremist elements among the opposition. But all along, it was about Syria itself. It was all along about what is Syria doing, what is the war doing to the people, and what might Syria's crisis do to the whole of the Middle East. Right now, that's not what is at stake. Syria is all about America's credibility. I mean, the entire exercise of negotiations involving Russia, finding a way first to protect American credibility over the red line that the president drew over a year ago about use of chemical weapons, and now whether this can be resolved through some kind of a United Nations supervised process, is really all about American credibility. And that actually makes it much more relevant to a broader global audience, because American credibility and trust in American foreign policy, consistency of American foreign policy, is not a Middle East issue. It's a much larger issue. So the President, the Secretary of State constantly point to Iran as the principal country that is watching how Syria unfolds. Is the United States actually serious about enforcing things? But there's a lot of other countries around the world which are watching. I was on the way to this region. I passed through Seoul, South Korea, and there the conversation was all about how does the North Korean regime look at what happened or what happens in Syria. And that's an important issue, largely because there are varieties of geostrategic issues in this region as well, North Korea being the most important, where the United States' policy and credibility is at the crux of the current balance, and how each actor calculates continuity, stability, or the next step that they take. Now, once the dust in Syria settles, the Middle East is going to continue to be a challenge for American foreign policy, and also, if you would, a test of United States' ability to manage and the credibility of American foreign policy. So 2 years ago, the Middle East was about democracy. It was about whether a popular uprising, led by social media and connectivity between societies, led by the middle classes, angry middle classes, demanding social freedoms and greater things, would actually topple Arab dictatorships that had been there for decades. Now the main story in the Middle East is how quickly will those Arab dictatorships reverse the trend and get back in the saddle. So while we're really focused on Syria, the pivot case in the Middle East is Egypt. And what happened before the use of chemical weapons was much more important to the future of the Middle East. As I said, Syria is about American credibility. Egypt is really the window into the region. So, this whole Arab Spring really began in a big way in Egypt when Mubarak was pushed from power by a very peaceful, and at that point it looked like a liberal, secular uprising. The uprising then went through a democratically elected government that very quickly became fundamentalist and unpopular. And then you basically had a popular return of military government to power. So, the Arab Spring in Egypt went full cycle. And in some ways, Syria is also about the same thing. At the core of it, if you put away the instruments by which the two sides are fighting, the real issue in Syria is whether the old regime will survive, whether Syria will end up in a much more bloody way, essentially go through the same process that Egypt went through. But even if that happens, even when the dust settles, say that you end up with an authoritarian regime in Egypt and an authoritarian regime in Syria, whether it's under Assad or someone else, this whole experience in the Middle East has brought issues to the fore that are not going to go away. And here they are. One is that it has opened up a significant sectarian schism or a sectarian division in the region. So Syria has exposed the fact that the different sects of Islam, the Shias and the Sunnis, have very different conceptions of politics, of power, of distribution of power, and that has now come out in the very open. So they stand on different sides of the Syrian divide. And that difference runs not only in Syria, it runs into Lebanon, Iraq, Bahrain, Pakistan, Afghanistan. I mean, across the region, you now have a division of opinion that almost is like an ethnic conflict, except ethnicity is not defined by race or language, it's defined by what branch of Islam do you identify with. Those who are familiar with European history would think of a Protestant Catholic division in places like Northern Ireland. And now that's out in the open. What makes it significant is that it is not just destabilizing within individual countries like Iraq or Syria or Lebanon, but actually it defines the broader geostrategic division in the Middle East, which is, look at the big powerhouses in the Middle East. Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Iran. They stand on opposite sides of this, right? They may have their own disagreements, but look at Syria. So, the Turkish government and the Saudi government are opposed to Assad. Iran supports Assad. Look at Iraq. You have the same lineup. Look at Bahrain. You have the same lineup. Now, relations are not between them necessarily always antagonistic. Turkey and Iran do a lot of trade and economic relations, but they each reflect, if you would, this larger division in the region. Now, with a region with no superpower balancing it, in the manner in which the United States had done for a very long time, is much more open to this spilling out in the open. And then there are other things that the Arab Spring has brought to the fore. So if you looked at Egypt, you would see which countries supported the return of the military to power. And these were by and large the monarchies in the Persian Gulf. Now, these monarchies in the Persian Gulf are generally known to be supportive of Islamic politics in the Middle East. They're not secular regimes. So why were they opposed to an Islamic government in Egypt? They're opposed because the issue is not Islam or secularism. The issue is really monarchy versus republicanism. Islamic fundamentalism is an ideology. It does look to religion in a very particular way in politics, but at its core actually is a very modern idea. It's a republican idea. It believes in, the power of the masses. It doesn't support politics being invested by class or caste. It definitely doesn't believe in monarchy. And ultimately, the fact that Egypt has pitted the monarchies of the Persian Gulf, be they religious or not, against the Muslim Brotherhood Party, which represents fundamentalism, means that even within the Sunni side of the equation, there is division. Now, one of the ironies of the past few months is that Iran has emerged from the Arab Spring as the most stable country in the Middle East. Look, they ran an election. Everybody thought it was going to be a disaster. There's going to be millions of people in the street. It was successful. It had a surprise outcome. The regime looked like, it could tolerate openness. Today, Iran lifted filter on Facebook and Twitter. You could, Washington Post correspondent in Iran tweeted from his state telecommunication company telephone. He posted this first tweet. So, Iran is actually handling openness much better. There is a lot more trouble in Istanbul than there is in Tehran. And America's, if you would, biggest nemesis in the region actually has come out unscathed by this. And if you added Syria, Iran is doing actually pretty well in Syria. Its side is still winning. The light may be shining on Russia, but people forget that Russian policy in Syria is built on Iranian shoulders. It's the Iranians that are sustaining the Assad regime, not the Russians. The Russians are carrying the weight in the international community. But on the ground, the performance of the Syrian forces that give the president of Russia the kind of confidence that he feels is born of Iran's ability to carry the war. So, this is also suggests that, this division in the region is going to be complicated. Now, you can look at this picture and then you can look at what are the most important statements of American foreign policy of the past 4 years. The most important statement is we're pivoting to Asia, right? We're just packing up, and we believe there is only one area of the world worthy of our attention, and that's the Asia-Pacific region. And you could say there is good reason for that. It accounts for 40% of the global GDP. It is the fastest growing segment of the global economy. By 2025, it would be probably the majority of the global GDP. And the US is worried that unless it gets in there quickly, that basically this will be a Chinese sphere of influence from which the United States would be excluded. So basically, you could call pivot to Asia as a way for America to put options on the table. I mean, in a business sense, exercise options. Which is, and how you do that is security-wise. Try to muscle your way into the South China Sea dispute to keep Southeast Asia much more sort of in a no man's land. The reason why there is so much aggressiveness in concluding the Trans-Pacific partnership is basically, if you really thought of it, this is high-stakes global trade competition. Where the United States, between a free trade position in Europe and a free trade position in Asia, is trying to block off the two biggest chunks of the global GDP within a free trade zone that would be disadvantageous to its main global rival, which Washington thinks these days is China. And therefore, the assumption is that this will happen. But pivot to Asia means different things to different people. Now, I won't venture into what it means to people in this region, much better than I. But people in the Middle East, governments in the Middle East, read pivot to Asia means we can't wait to get rid of you. We don't want to have anything to do with this region. Pivot to Asia was read as meaning leaving the Middle East. So where you were going was less important than the fact that you were going. And this was driven by a great deal of arguments about the fact that America is now energy independent. It really doesn't need this region, although this is actually not true at very levels, but psychologically it does shape attitudes. Because by and large, the United States hasn't been dependent on Middle East oil for a very long time. Only about 20% of its oil comes from the Middle East. And every partner the United States is banking on in Asia does need Middle East oil, which is India, Korea, Japan. So in a de facto way, the United States is dependent on Middle East oil, whether it likes it or not. And also, really, the reason the United States is in the Middle East is not because of oil. This is a legacy thinking of 1970s. The United States is in the Middle East because of terrorism and because of Israel, because of its special relationship with Israel. And with oil or without oil, it will be there. In fact, the poorer the Middle East gets, the more terrorism there will be, the more the United States is going to be involved in the Middle East. Now, one of the outcomes is that the Middle East has decided, well, you're not the only one who's going to pivot to Asia. We can pivot to Asia too. And therefore, you're seeing actually a much more aggressive turn towards Asia from the Middle East, whether it's the Turkish prime minister making a big pitch in China. His first trip to China, he took 300 CEOs with him. He quickly resolved any kind of a Turkish meddling in western part of China, said very loud and clear in Urumqi that he believes in a one China policy, and then went to business of trying to conclude as much business as is possible with China. So and European policies and the declining European markets was very important. Iran has continuously tried to look to China as a main investor in the region, but also as a partner in Central Asia. And now the Gulf countries are also turning in a big way towards Asia. Now, some of this, you would say, is obvious, that they have already been selling oil and gas to Asia, and they will continue to sell oil and gas to Asia. So 80% of Middle East oil goes to Asia, and probably the Chinese portion of this is likely to increase. And that if you looked at it from Asia's perspective, most of their oil comes from the Middle East. And the energy revolution will support this, because if America is producing gas at $3 a BTU and Qatar is producing at $15 a BTU, Qatar is going to be selling east, not west. But it's in more than that. It's also in the pattern of sovereign fund investments. It's in the pattern of business investments. And it is not the way we always think, that it's money from Asia and China going to the Middle East. It's much more interesting is money going from sovereign funds of the Persian Gulf to invest in China and in Asia. There is a deliberate strategy of anchoring Middle East's strategic future in Asia, economic but also political. And this has a lot to do with the way the Middle East has understood the pivot argument, and watching the manner in which the United States is fairly disengaged from the Middle East and is not playing a stabilizing role. The other interesting part of this is that, at some level, China is also moving in the direction of the West. And that's not because China is eager to replace America or out of that concern. But it's a fact of geography and is a fact of economics. So China's population and industrial centers are moving west. China's energy needs point to the Middle East. China is looking for markets, and people often don't think of the Middle East as a big market, but it is a big market. I mean, you could take a country like Pakistan. The size of its middle class is bigger than the whole country of Iraq. You take a look at the size of the middle class in the Gulf, middle class in Iran, middle class in the Arab world. It's actually the sweet spot for a lot of Chinese exports, whether it's from mobiles to textiles. The Chinese have been able to leverage their exports in Africa, with the middle class. The middle class in the Middle East is wealthier and larger per country than middle class in Africa. It is a right strategy, if you would. And those countries also see, value in that kind of a relationship. But most importantly, Middle East is about transportation hubs and transportation linkages. So whether you look at Turkey, which is becoming a major transportation hub for oil and gas from northern Iraq, southern Iraq, from Azerbaijan, or you look at Iran and Afghanistan, the whole idea of a new Silk Road. But on the energy side, this is about pipelines and railway lines running north-south from Central Asia to the Arabian Sea, and then east-west all the way from northern Iraq and Iran through Pakistan and potentially onto western China. Now, plenty of energy and trade goes on high seas, but in fact, the more the United States keeps threatening the control of the Indian Ocean, the Straits of Malacca chokehold, touting its naval presence as part of its competition in Asia Pacific, the more incentive there is to build these lines that go around the Straits of Malacca and provide China with alternatives. Now, that's an interesting issue because, in some ways you would think that the United States is not going anywhere out of the Middle East, despite its best efforts. I mean, since we've declared the pivot, the U.S. Secretary of State seems to have been camped out in the Middle East. He has, I think, made one trip to Asia, and that's going to be it for a while. But the other, and if China and now Russia are playing a much bigger role in the Middle East, then Middle East actually becomes an arena where this G2, G3, although I think Russia would like to be counted as a G, but I'm not sure that it has legs. But at least in terms of a G2, is going to be played out in the Middle East. It's about Asia Pacific, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be played there. It's going to be played in the Middle East. And we have to think about how this plays out. So you could say that when you look at Central Asia, successfully this has become an arena where China and Russia basically jointly are managing the region. So the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which just met about a week ago, in a de facto way, has become the ASEAN, or choose your metaphor here, for Central Asia. The United States is absent there. It is about China and Russia jointly taking stewardship of a region in security terms, foreign policy terms, and economic terms. And their major regional partner there is Iran. And when you look at the Levant, Russia is making a big play for Syria, but that area is largely going to be between Russia and the United States. But when you look at the Persian Gulf, the rich energy base of Persian Gulf, this in the end will have both China and the United States in the mix. The question becomes what would be each of the powers' priorities and how they would play. Now, what I think is very interesting is that if one were to sort of try to imagine how China may handle Iraq versus Saudi Arabia, nuclear Iran versus Saudi Arabia, probably you could look at China's management of Northeast Asia. And that's a policy of strategic patience, economic investment, working the issue gradually, no confrontation with either side. It's a policy of creating stability where stability doesn't exist or shouldn't exist. So I think the window into how China might manage Pakistan, Afghanistan, Iran, Saudi Arabia is largely the lesson of Northeast Asia. On the other hand, I think people in Northeast Asia are trying to look that the future of American presence there can be gleaned from the way the United States is managing the Middle East. And that's not a good lesson. That, the minute an ally of 37 years is in trouble, you get on a podium and tell him you need to get out right now, and there's not even a thank you note for 37 years of friendship. Or that you draw red lines and you essentially are not willing to enforce it. So, I think, these are really the larger issues that are on the table, because even in the minds of the United States, the most important issue today, right or wrong, is China. It's not Syria. But the sort of the problems that we confront in Syria or Egypt are ultimately reflect on that larger issue. Let me stop here and be very happy to hear your questions, as savage as they might be, per Ronnie's promise.
I just see our global trustee, Nicholas Rohatyn, just walk in. Take a bow. Nicholas, great to have you, huh? We also have several people who are first time here. I'm sure there's a lot more that I will not mention one by one, but we're delighted to have Foreign Ministry of China, 参赞 Yang Wen 女士 being present here with us. We also have the Deputy Consul General from the United States, Tom Cooney. I have to pronounce that word carefully. And then thank you, Chris Chan, for getting all these Johns Hopkins parents together. For those of them who are not yet members, they better sign up or they watch this. No. Then finally, I want to also recognize UBS. Great to have Serafina Wong here. UBS is the supporter of our next show at the gallery together with Guggenheim. So it will open in October 29th, I believe it is, 28th or 29th. Anyway, okay, floor's open. Again, student, you're welcome to ask the first questions. You don't have to. I'll be watching, but anybody, okay? Okay, no student yet? Yes, sir. Go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, there, sorry, thank you. So you mentioned that Asian countries can look to the U.S. policy in the Middle East as a model for how America would treat issues in the region. And I think you argued that the ambiguity and perhaps the somewhat unpredictable nature of American foreign policy will be a liability. However, could you not also make the argument that it is, in fact, America's ambiguity in the region that creates some level of stability? Because if neither side can really predict how America will act in, let's say, the South China Sea dispute, does that not dissuade countries from taking, say, aggressive actions to resolve the South China Sea dispute? Could you not see America's ambiguity and unpredictable foreign policy as an asset in that regard?
Very good point. Although I would say in Syria, we are quite unambiguous. I mean, the ambiguity is gone. It's very clear that the U.S. did not want to enforce its red line, and in the end didn't. And I mean, it's possible that in fact, in public statements, including the president's interview on Sunday, he went out of his way to say that Iran should not misread the fact that we didn't enforce our red line, which means that he's very worried that Iran will actually misread the red lines. Otherwise, it doesn't require. And then Secretary Kerry again repeated the same issue in his press conference in Paris. I mean, from what I know from Iran, I could tell you that Iranians believe that all options on the table is not true, that all options are not on the table. The option of a military strike against Iran is no longer on the table. It's very difficult to convince them it is, because, unless you actually do it, you have to believe that the other side has to believe that there's a good chance you would do it. I think the Iranians never really thought that there was a good chance. Now I think they're pretty convinced that if the president is hesitant in tackling Syria, he would be definitely hesitant tackling Iran. And let me just add one other thing. It's not just the act, it's all the justification for why we don't do it. So if you listen to what we said as reasons why we wouldn't do it, we don't want another costly war. Well, North Korea or Iran would be 10 times more expensive than Syria. The American public is tired of war. We have problems at home. I mean, once you go through the list, you almost are making a case about why we will not, if we can go to a lesser war, we're not going to go to a higher war. Then you're put in a position about how you nevertheless convince your adversaries as well as your allies that this doesn't apply to you. And I'm not saying that's not possible, but it's going to take a lot of work from American officials to do that. I mean, including the fact that, pretty soon they should be, camping out in this region, trying to make the case.
Okay, the gentleman. Yeah. On the left. Yeah. And then followed by Charlie Shi.
Hi, David Pilling of the Financial Times. On the one hand, you paint this picture of kind of US disengagement in the Middle East now. Then you say, but we shouldn't expect the US to kind of withdraw because its interests are not primarily oil there, Israel, terrorism, stability, etc. So what are we seeing now? Is this a kind of a temporary American setback? Or, do you expect the US to come roaring back in? Or is this actually the beginning of a different kind of engagement? And just folded into that, I mean, how do you see the US-Saudi Arabian relationship? Is that really sustainable in the long term?
Well, it's a very good point. I mean, the issue is that we're sort of in a sort of an in-between phase. We made up our mind that we're leaving. We don't want to be engaged. So if you looked at the Arab Spring, even when it was a hopeful idea, we never got engaged with Egypt the way we got engaged with Philippines when Marcos left. We sort of didn't give the economic aid, the technical aid, the assistance. It was almost like saying, great, you're going democratic, you're on your own, hopefully you'll make it, but we really don't have a dog in this fight and we're not going to get involved. We proceeded on that, but things in the region have become worse and worse to a point where they demand our attention. So we have a reactive policy of getting involved when you have a flare-up, like in Egypt or in Syria, but we don't have a forward strategy of what is it that our interests are in this region and how we're going to address them. I suspect at some point, and this might be easier under the next administration, to basically say, this whole assumption that we could just leave the Middle East and assume that it won't matter and go somewhere else in the world was a false assumption. And that we have to have a proper policy for the Middle East. It doesn't need to be, the way it was under the Bush administration where everything was the Middle East, but it cannot be no engagement, which is the assumption of the Obama administration either, that we have vital interests and that we increasingly can see that, we can't pick and choose where we want to compete with Russia or China, and that we would have to have a proper strategy for this region. But right now we don't. I mean, it's if you again looked at, the reason why we were amenable to a Russian intervention in this is not just because we didn't want to use force. It's also because it is a way not to get too engaged in the Syrian problem. So, our inclination is that we don't want to decide the outcome in Syria. We don't want to be sucked into somebody else's civil war. And we sort of assume that we can fix it and move on. What I'm trying to say is that, there is a fundamental underlying assumption about American foreign policy that hasn't been revised, which is premised on the fact that we can leave the Middle East and nothing will happen and it doesn't matter, and we can go focus on Asia. But you can see the reality. We can't focus on Asia because we can't get out of the Middle East. And that at some point in time you can go against a reality for only so long. At some point it has to be corrected.
Charlie Shi, and then the gentleman in front.
Thank you, Professor. I have 3 questions, but I make it quick. The first one, the British Parliament's voting down of the Cameron government's suggestion to go into Syria along with the US. Is this a turning point for the US-British relationship in terms of a joint overseas military action since World War II? If yes, what does it mean to the US? That's number one. The second question I have is, what was the last time that the Liberal Democrats and the Libertarian Republicans jointly for one particular situation? It was almost never. Does it really mean that the Wilson interventionalists and also FDR interventionalists, this type of ideology is facing a very strong headwind right now. Number three, would you consider, you say Syria's situation is a credibility issue for the U.S. government. Would you consider these as one of those fundamental cracks for a political party that Republicans might have a fighting chance in year 2016?
Well, on the British, let's wait and see. I think you shouldn't expect that they always would vote for you. The British are also voting on other kinds of things, like the fact that they want to leave Euro and want to put it to a referendum. I mean, there's all kinds of things that might be disturbing, but I wouldn't read too much in it. As to the fact that the mood in America is so anti-war, you can't for 4 years be basically relaying a particular message to your population, which foreign policy doesn't matter, the Middle East doesn't matter, we don't care about this region, and then all of a sudden say, oh, it does. I mean, if you read the past 2 years, the president had gone out of his way to constantly say, it doesn't matter how many people die in Syria, it's not our concern. So, when he, in an interview, said, how do I square off tens of thousands of people dying in Syria with tens of thousands of people dying in the Congo? He was basically saying this is no more important to Americans than Congo. And I won't go into how important the Americans think Congo is. So you can't all of a sudden turn it on a dime and say that, this really matters. So, it is, yes, the Americans are tired of war, but engagement in the Middle East is not that you either go occupy countries or you don't do anything, because that's the way it's been put on the table, that we either have to go occupy Syria or we shouldn't do anything. There were many things in between. Some of the solutions that they're discussing now were proposed by Hillary Clinton and General Petraeus a year and a half ago, about the fact that you would have trained your own rebel army in Syria from scratch. Had we done that a year and a half ago, we wouldn't have to contemplate a lot of these things. The scene in Syria would have been quite different. Had we engaged diplomatically a year and a half ago, it would have been very different. But I don't think the administration has ever made the case for why foreign policy matters, why we should be engaged in the region, why what happens to Syria matters to us. So it's not a surprise that they face this stiff resistance. Now, yes, I think this, in a very interesting way, is going to become, the relationship between the White House and Congress was not good to begin with, and the Republicans may smell blood in the water, and they may figure that, the administration is weaker on immigration and healthcare and a host of other issues. And if they read, that the reason the president agreed to work with Putin was because he was afraid of a defeat in Congress, then, they may read many other things into that, because on those domestic issues, there's no Putin to rely on. So it remains to be seen.
In front, and then Andrew Leung.
Ernst Herb, I'm correspondent of Finanz und Wirtschaft, Swiss newspaper. You made a very compelling reason for strategic reasons why the US wants to move, as you said, from the Middle East to the Far East. But for strategic reasons like demand-driven, you made the point, China's rise, the economic interests in the future of the US will be much more in this region. But in the light that foreign policy in the Middle East by the US is not so much made by the State Department or the White House, but by Congress, to what degree that the demographic change in the US is very fast in the last 10 years. Asian voters play a much bigger role now in the US. To what degree is this move of the strategic move from the US to that region also because voters want to have that?
I don't think so, and I tell you why. Because the very first act of pivot to Asia was not economic, was military. So the very first act was to put 2,500 Marines in Australia and declare that we're going to build the Indian military into a behemoth to stand up to China, and we're going to beef up the Filipino Navy, and we're going to strengthen Vietnam. I don't think Asian Americans are of one opinion, if not opposed to these. So this was not a charm offensive with Asia. It was very clearly pivot to Asia in its first iteration could very easily have been read as containment of China. It was very clear there. Secondly, is that the United States should pay a lot more attention to this region. But this sort of a binary view that it's either that we are all in the Middle East or that we're all out of the Middle East and in Asia is problematic. And secondly, we don't need to be in the Middle East only with occupying armies. And we don't need to be in Asia only with a big military footprint. So now you see that America's policy in Asia has become actually all about trade. So, you could be negotiating free trade with this region and at the same time have been engaged economically with Egypt to help its democracy grow roots. I mean, I think the very idea from the beginning, and that's why the Middle Easterners don't agree with the logic that it was necessary to tell them that we're leaving this region because we need to go to Asia. So we're either here with military presence with hundreds of thousands of troops, or we're not engaged at all. So, if you had spent 3 months worth of money we pay for the US troops in Afghanistan into the Egyptian economy right after Mubarak fell or right after Morsi became president, it would have made a huge difference in that country.
Andrew?
Well, thank you for a very insightful overview. You mentioned trade just now. America, of course, is reducing its energy dependence, particularly on the Middle East, what with the shale gas revolution and oil revolution in the United States. And sooner rather than later, America is going to be the world's largest energy exporter, even bigger than Saudi Arabia. Do you think to what extent this would change the dynamics in the Middle East as far as China is concerned? Because China is likely to be the main purchaser of any excess energy from the United States. When we talk about trade, of course, you pay attention to your biggest customer.
Right. Well, going forward, a lot of these assumptions have to be unpacked. So the energy revolution is most promising about shale gas. It's not as promising about tight oil. That you may on a map look and say, oh, there's a lot of tight oil in this area, but it doesn't mean that it's economical to actually get it out. The first batch might be at a price point of $70 a barrel. The second one might be $150 a barrel, and you have to keep drilling. And it's very, very likely that a lot of this tight oil will actually never be drilled. And I think the bigger story in the Middle East is actually whether Iraq will come online, not whether the US would. But most people would say, oil prices are not going to drastically go down between how much new supply there might be and how much new demand is going to be created. So more important than whether the US is going to produce more oil, the question is how much emerging market growth might impact the demand for oil. On issue of gas, that's fairly important. But again, gas in the U.S. is not a straight shoot. So the two main gas reserves, one is in North Dakota. That's fairly easy to get out to. But the Marcellus formation in the Northeast could run into all kinds of legal and other troubles because it runs through some of the most populated areas of the United States. But let's say that gas comes out. Its main initial impact is on two things. Is on competitiveness of American manufacturing, whether it makes sense for many factories to move back from different places to the United States. And secondly, which could have an implication of balance of trade and global flow of money that underlies the way we do trade today. The second issue is that if the US actually decides to export gas, it will have an impact on, it already has an impact on coal. So the main impact of America's gas revolution is that America has become cleaner and Europe and Asia have become dirtier because price of coal has gone down. The second issue is that the United States could actually have a downward pressure on gas prices globally. So that will impact countries like, I think recently Korea walked away from a long-term deal with Australia over gas because they thought the prices would go down once the US comes online. Or Qatar won't be able to sell gas at $15, $16 a BTU. Now, the impact on the Middle East is, if Middle East becomes poorer, then it's going to be more troublesome. This actually means it's going to be more of a headache for the United States. So if China can buy its gas from somewhere else, including the United States, China may actually be able to walk away from the Middle East much easier than the United States will. So some of these arguments are psychological. They're not really thought through. As I said, we already are energy independent from the Middle East. It's the other issues in the Middle East that keep us there. Why should the United States care about Syria? In the end, it's either because Al-Qaeda is going to take over large chunks of Syria and sooner or later they're going to show up on Times Square in New York, or that they're going to be a threat to Israel. So that issue is not going to go away. We don't have a solution for that. And in fact, beating our chest with how we're going to push energy prices globally down does not address how we're going to deal with 300 million angry, hungry young Middle Easterners after that.
Gentlemen, yeah.
Russia's relationship with Syria is roughly equivalent to China's relationship with North Korea. And the six-party talks intended to roll back North Korea's nuclear capabilities are roughly analogous to the process that the U.S. and Russia want to get underway to roll back Syria's chemical weapons. Is there any reason to believe that, given the fact that the six-party talks have utterly failed to impact North Korea's nuclear program because the U.S. and China have failed to find strong convergence of interests, and that has enabled North Korea to manipulate the situation? Is there any reason to believe the process in Syria will be any different?
Well, the first point, I think, if you're drawing the comparison, what China is to North Korea, Iran is to Syria, not Russia. I mean, part of the whole dilemma is that the most important country in this is not at the table. That's why it's not going to work. So, what if Iran doesn't agree with Russia? Russia is important to Syria at the UN. Iran is important to Syria on the ground. It's Iranian money, soldiers, material, intelligence, fighters that are sustaining Assad. So the military victories he's had on the ground is because of Iran. So you could say that we're negotiating. This is kind of like a kabuki play now. The Russians are really the face behind which, we're negotiating with Iran. If that's the case, I'm more hopeful with that. That, the Russians basically are speaking for the Iranians at the table. But I think you're absolutely right. I'm not actually hopeful this will work. The answer is very simple. Why would Assad do this? We already said that we're not going to hurt you too much. We don't want a regime change. We don't want to get involved in a war. We want to punish you for what you did, and we don't want you to do it again. So yes, it's going to be painful, but it's not going to be, mortal. So he gives up these chemical weapons, and if you're Assad, you say, well, how do I prevent a fate like Gaddafi's? So I give up the WMD, and in a few years' time, NATO would remove me of power. And how do I survive? So you have to think that either there is a secret protocol to this agreement, which we don't know about, according to which the Russians will provide Syria with a blanket strategic agreement, and we agree not to supply the rebels and to prevent Saudis from supplying the rebels. So Assad will give this up and then survives and wins. Otherwise, why would he do it? Or that Assad is going to begin asking things once we get going. So yes, the United Nations can go in and catalog everything he has, but then he's going to begin to say, well, I'll give this up if I get X and if I get Y, and if I don't, you're right, we're going to end up at the same place. But I mean, no, we haven't really thought through, why would Assad do this?
Nasr, I have one more question. I know that you're an advisor to the American government. If the president were to call you and say, whatever you says, I'll do, how should the United States deal with Iran? You know that probably better than 99.999% of the people in America.
Well, not that call will come, but let's. I think there is an opportunity with Iran. I think I think the Iranians are actually serious about one thing. They want the sanctions to go away. We want to negotiate over a nuclear program. They want to negotiate over sanctions. We've been successful at getting something on the table that the Iranians are willing to negotiate over. We should first of all not make a confusion that actually sanctions will force a country to give something up completely. It won't cause surrender, but it's a negotiating point. So you have to come up with a negotiation strategy where you could get things from them in exchange for lifting of sanctions. So the negotiations are going to be difficult. They're going to be tedious. There's a lack of trust on both sides. There's not going to be a grand bargain, silver bullet meeting. I think the definition of success in the first meeting is going to be a second meeting. And gradually you have to have something that the two actually agree to and exchange and holds for 6 months' time that you can build on. I don't see Iran giving up its entire nuclear program because, first of all, they've spent billions of dollars and they're too deeply invested in it. Secondly, because they have concerns about regime survival. They watched what happened to Gaddafi. We've given billions of dollars to of military equipment to Iran's neighbors. Those things won't go back to the supplier afterwards. So, the Iranians are not going to give this up, but I think there is room to get them to cap this and stay within certain bounds. That may not be acceptable to Israel, and that would be a problem for the U.S. It may not be acceptable to the U.S. Congress, but I think it's as good as it can get. And if there is a path for Iran to actually have some early gains, and they give up some gains, then you might actually create a process that can move forward. But that's not a given that 5 years down the line, we're not in the same place we are now with North Korea. So, it looked very hopeful at one time, and now they're restarting their nuclear reactor again, and we'll have to deal with that.
Something in that part of the world I haven't been able to figure out even the beginning of it, and that is with Israel finding oil these days offshore, Yes. Tremendous amount of it, and in fact they're going to start flowing very, very soon. Will that mean, and how does it matter to the whole equation of the Middle East and in its relationship with the major powers of the United States?
I think the most immediate would be that it will make a big impact on where Europe stands on Middle East issues. Because Europe obviously is if it becomes dependent on gas from Israel, then it will take a very different position, or could take a very different position. I think
Well, yeah, you're right. I forgot the dean has to leave. He has a meeting, but it's okay. I'll give Victor a phone call. There's a book out there by the dean. I hope you'll pick up a copy on the way out. If you can catch the dean, maybe he'll sign it for you anyway. And finally, thank you for the book, by the way. So in return, the Chinese say that it is impolite not to return a gift, and hence a book on our last exhibition, as well as the typical gift that we give for all the speakers. Thank you very much, Dean.
Thank you.